I think it's fair to say, though, that just when you think you've got him nailed, he'll give you an unexpected point of view. It's been happening for his entire life, and this is just how he likes it to be. Christopher Hitchens has just published his memoir. It's called Hitch-22, and he's in Sydney to attend the Sydney Writers' Festival. He's in our breakfast studio right now. Christopher, welcome to Breakfast in the Flesh.
Very nice of you to have me.
Finally, a pleasure to finally meet you. Christopher, I'm wondering what it was like to write about yourself for a change. After years of writing about others, interviewing others, talking about others, how hard was that?
Harder than I'd thought. I wondered about halfway through, why is this so difficult? And I realised what it was. It's usually when I write, as you point out, I'm making a case, I'm making an argument. Sometimes it's a polemic, an attack. Sometimes, by the way, I should say for myself, I write quite warm and furry and friendly books too, in praise of Thomas Jefferson, for example, or George Orwell, or explaining Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. But anyway, in those cases too, I'm making a case or an argument. When I'm writing about myself, I'm not really making a case or an argument. It isn't written as an apology, for example. It's an account, sometimes an explanation, but more often just a description. So that's one thing. Second, normally I'm trying to see how much I can pack into, let's say 5 or 10, or in long cases, 20,000 words, how economical I can be, how much I can get into that pint pot. With autobiography or memoir, you keep remembering things you've completely forgotten, and you bung them down while you can. So it balloons out on you, it bags out, and I wrote twice as much as the publisher asked for.
I imagine sometimes that process must be so with any memoir of dredging up the past and trying to make sense of it is often quite painful, and it's clear that that is so. I mean, the book starts with the story of Yvonne, your mother, which is clearly a very painful thing for a young man, because Yvonne suicided when you were just 24 years old.
Yes.
How painful was it to go through that when, as you make clear in the memoir, you spent decades really going over and over the pain of that moment?
Well, I realised I couldn't do the book unless I could get that done first, because otherwise I'd be thinking about it all the time and perhaps leading up to it or partly suppressing it. So I just open with a death in the family. Tragic one because she was young. She'd fallen in love with an unsuitable guy. I think he talked her into a suicide pact. I can never be exactly sure. That's my feeling. Well, the chapter sort of shows how I had to investigate it, because it was initially reported as a crime scene, as a murder, and I found that it wasn't. And
you were the member of the family that went there, was in Athens.
Yes,
you flew there too.
It was in Athens during a time of war and revolution as well, a very dramatic time of military coup and rebellion. So it was an extraordinary and very wrenching and lacerating week in my life, yeah. And, well, you've only got one mother, and no one is really being honest about themselves, I think, unless they write something fairly open about their parents at the beginning.
You say in the book, I've intermittently sunk myself over the course of the past 4 decades or so into dismal attempts to imagine or think or feel myself into my mother's state of mind as she decided that the remainder of her life would be simply not be worth living. It's a very... it must be a very difficult thing to do and to be stuck in. How stuck were you in that process of trying to get back to your mother's state of mind?
Quite a lot, because of all the people one could picture. Obviously, I'm the only person here who knew her, but very, very difficult to imagine anyone who with such joie de vivre as Yvonne had, coming to that literal conclusion. I don't want any more of this life. I've looked up the road and I'm not willing to go there. It's a waste of time. It would be too painful to do. Very, very difficult to picture someone who was always so pro-life in every way, coming to that conclusion. I think I can make a guess. I think it was a bad time of her life to be a woman, if you know what I mean. I think she had been very beautiful, and she was, I think, in her own mind, ceasing to be. And I think she thought that the new lover was probably the last chance, and it wasn't working out. She didn't think she could get away with another one. So I can imagine that, all right, and I can imagine it giving her the blues. But what I do find still amazing is the thought that she decided to make an end of it. Unless, as I say, he talked her into it, which is my provisional conclusion. While we're on this, I mean, I don't know if it's a bit much for breakfast time for some people, probably, even for me, actually, but the really awful thing was when I got to this terrible hotel in Athens and saw the crime scene. I did a lot of work to try and find out what had happened, and at the switchboard in the hotel, there was a record of her several times having tried to call me in London, and I was always out. I was a young man then. And I'm very haunted by the thought that if she ever heard my voice, if she had got me, even if she didn't tell me why she was ringing, that she might have thought, no, I'm not going to.
And it's clear from the book that you, in a sense, believe that you owe your journey into public intellectualism to your mother. She was the one who fought for you to have an education. When you really
Yes.
couldn't afford it, you weren't sort of to the manor born. That's not where you came from.
No, I'm the first member of my family to go to a university, for example, or to go to a boys' private school. And I remember when I was quite small, you know how you're sitting on the top of the stairs and your parents having a row? And I was eavesdropping, and the row was this, very simple. My father was saying, we can't afford to send him to this school. You know, we don't have the money. And my mother said, look, Eric, that was his name, if there's going to be a ruling class in this country, if there's going to be one, Christopher's going to be in it, all right? And I was so silently cheering her on, because I didn't know what ruling class meant, but I did like the idea of going away to school.
And you have said that a public intellectual is in some sense something that you are rather than something that you do. Do you think that applies to you, that it was there within, and would it have happened if you hadn't been sent away to school, for instance? Would it have emerged?
All I know about that is I learned to read earlier than most kids did, but that was largely my mother pushing me, I have to say. But I was always ahead in reading age, and I always had an interest in a wide variety of books. And I was lucky with some teachers too. That's before I went away, who would get me books in the library. There were no books at home, so yeah, it could be that was my bent in any case. Yes, but knowing you've got a lovely woman on your side and in your corner is a huge start in life, however poor you are.
It's 8:13 on RM Breakfast. Our guest this morning is Christopher Hitchens. He's released his memoir. It's called Hitch-22. It's a life as you write it, or as we know it anyway. We've all shared much of it with you to some extent, peppered with associations with political leaders, thinkers, writers. A marvellous life to live, but also a position of some responsibility. I mean, led into the internal workings of government even at some points. Do you feel that, does that responsibility bear heavily on you? And is it difficult sometimes, given you know these people so well, it would seem,
Yes.
to write as critically as you do write? Pay a high price, I imagine.
That's a very searching question. I mean, I've lived in Washington for almost 30 years now, and for most of that time, I would have really resented it if anyone had described me, which they often used to, as if it was flattering, as an insider. I absolutely wasn't one. I was very much not on the inside, and was generally in the opposition. So it was a very new experience for me to find, when the argument over the war in Iraq was mounting to its crescendo, within myself, a sympathy with the government position. I thought that in a sense, that the Bush administration had not had my vote. So they were right, that Saddam Hussein had run out the clock on the United Nations and on international law several times, and there was time to do something about it. So I was looking at things for the first time in my life, really from the government, from the establishment's point of view. Quite a vertiginous feeling for someone like myself. And I thought, I know what people will say as well. He's really sold out this time. But I thought that's just too bad. I mean,
Are you still rowing with people about that?
Oh, sure, yeah, I will be for the rest of my life. There's a long chapter in the book where it's, again, not an apology for myself, but it's an attempt to explain what I thought the case for regime change was, and why I think still, in front of a huge number of people, it's been subjected to an extraordinary campaign of defamation and misrepresentation. So it's an attempt to show, well, even if we were wrong, this is how we did feel, and this is what we were saying.
And even with hindsight, you still cling to that position. We spoke to someone, Michael Otterman, earlier in the week, who's written a book about the displacement of people in Iraq, and how many hundreds of thousands of people left and won't come home because home is A, not safe, the quality of life is so degraded from what it was, the secular society that was there is being sort of wrought asunder, and it's just such a divided, difficult place to be. Still worth it?
Well, I understand that argument very well, and I've been a witness to a good bit of it too. I would say that the one reason for proposing an international intervention in Iraq was that the society was already imploding. I mean, remember, the Saddam Hussein regime, which, by the way, it's long ceased to be secular. It was openly allied with the forces of jihad in its propaganda and its actions. Didn't control two-thirds of its country. I mean, the majority of the Shia population and of the Kurdish population were under the protection of no-fly zones imposed by the international community, at which Saddam's forces fired, the protectors of which were under fire from Saddam's forces every day. that the regime lived by divide and rule, by stirring up the resentment between Arabs and Kurds and Sunni and Shia Muslims and others, and by making lunges in the direction of neighbours, keeping the pot boiling by permanent war. So that that the regime was itself imploding. Saddam was going mad. He had 2 psychopathic sons ready to take over who would probably have quarrelled among themselves, so that a ruined and maimed and traumatised Iraq was in our future no matter what. The question was, could we catch it before it went over the cliff? And we didn't quite.
And it remains.
We didn't quite. And
remains ruined and maimed, doesn't it?
And above all, traumatised. I mean, 30 years and more of continuous war and fascism and divide and rule does tend to leave its mark on a society, as did the international sanctions that had to be imposed because of a lawless and aggressive regime. So to blame this on the intervention is really to mistake cause for effect.
Publicly, Christopher Hitchens, for many of us here in Australia who hear you on the radio, on radio programs like this one, or on television programs, you seem so confident in your view, so confident in your politics, so confident in your public statements. I wonder if you have moments of self-doubt. For instance, you write about the young soldier, a guy called Mark Daly, whom you discovered after the fact had gone to a war, signed up for the Iraq War, after being influenced by something you wrote. He was killed in Iraq.
Yeah.
What kind of effect did that have on you?
No, well, I thought, having written this chapter of explanation about the regime change faction that I was in Washington and how it actually thought, I owed it to the customers to say what my doubts were and my misgivings and my second thoughts. And these most summarised by the fact that I heard one day of a young man named Mark Daly, a very handsome and brilliant and intelligent young man who had given up a very promising career in California to join the United States Army and go to Iraq, and had been killed in Kurdistan. And it turned out had left a statement behind on his MySpace page in case of his death, which he faced very stoically, in which he'd said that my work had helped to persuade him to join up. So I felt absolutely congealed with woe and unease when I heard that, and I thought, well, I've got to get in touch with his family, but for all I know, they'll tell me to really get lost, to put it mildly. So the rest of the chapter is an account of how, in fact, they welcomed me and reassured me. They said he was going to go. You know, he'd made up his mind, but he used to quote you as one of his reasons for doing so. But you don't have the sort of influence that would get such a decided and bright young person just to do what you said. And they remained very proud of him, in spite of the fact that they were opposed to the war themselves, could easily have done without it, and were devastated.
It's 8:19 on RM Breakfast. Christopher Hitchens is our guest. Christopher, I know it's been noted before, and I know you've been questioned closely before on the question of women. Now, reading this book, enormous number of people talked about, very few of them women. I'm not talking about sexual liaisons.
No.
I'm not saying why didn't you detail your different liaisons or even talk particularly at length about your wife or your wives, but not a lot of women mentioned in the same realm as the men, as thinkers and influencers.
That's true.
Why is that? Do you not have many female friends in this realm?
Oh, no, I'm not short of that. That I think, well, someone else should be saying this for me, I suppose. It's not really for me to say. I do have a note at the beginning of the book, a cautionary note saying, look, I only have copyrighted myself. So I don't really write about anyone, unless they're dead, whose privacy might be involved.
I'm not talking about privacy, I'm talking about public intellectuals,
no,
women in that sphere.
No, in my sphere there aren't that many of them.
Really?
No, there aren't. It's the fact. And the same when I wrote my novel, my collection of works about fiction, about novels.
That can't be true. I mean, there's
About
plenty
novelists.
of female authors and writers.
Well, no,
and
they're
journalists.
the ones that matter to me most, and the ones I featured. There were only two in that whole collection. George Eliot, who I regard as worth much more than any 10 of the others put together, but still there's only one of her. And then, strangely enough, Dorothy Parker, of whom I still have a great admiration. Most of the other authors that have influenced me have been male, it's true.
Now, Christopher, it goes without saying.
But I think you should mention the huge influence that Margaret Thatcher exerted on me.
Oh, right. Come on, you want to tell that story. We've got a minute left. Tell us the Margaret Thatcher story.
I can't do
it
it
is a classic.
in a minute. No, people have to buy the book.
All right, within a minute.
Tell them it might be worth their while.
Within a minute or so, it is worth your while.
Physical encounter with Margaret Thatcher is not something every man can boast of.
No, especially saying bend lower. Just very briefly, can I get your views of Barack Obama, how he's going in terms of conventional politics? You lost faith in a lot of that?
Well, I voted for the president with in a very positive way, as well as the negative way of, obviously I felt I couldn't vote for the McCain-Palin ticket. They made that easy enough. But it wasn't just voting against the Republicans. I voted positively for Obama because I like him as a writer. I thought his first volume of memoirs was very well written indeed and revealed a very attractive and thoughtful and self-critical personality.
What about as a president?
Well, then the question is that all you need to be president? Because actually you might want to be a bit more decisive than that. And that's my main worry now, that there are too many subjects, especially on the international arena, where the president seems to think that the problem arises from misunderstanding, and I'm afraid it probably doesn't. With North Korea, for example, it's not a misunderstanding or a cultural lag. It's a direct conflict.
So one can be too tolerant?
I'm afraid so.
Christopher Hitchens, thanks so much for joining us on Breakfast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Christopher Hitchens, and his memoir is called Hitch-22. It's published by Allen & Unwin, and he asked me to do this, and I will. It is worth having a look at. It's 8:22 on RM Breakfast.